I grabbed the wrong coffee cup on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday, and the name printed on the sleeve belonged to the coldest judge in the city. She came looking for it by sundown. She never really stopped. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 26 years old, and on the morning this started, I owned 4 blazers, 3 of which had a stain somewhere the dry cleaner swore he could fix, and never did. I worked in the sub-basement records room of the Vance County Courthouse, 2 floors below daylight, filing exhibits into steel cabinets that groaned when you opened them, like they resented being asked twice. Omega, unpresented until 19, which in this city was its own small scandal. People assumed something was wrong with you if your body waited that long to announce what you were. I'd stopped explaining it. Explaining cost more than it ever bought back. I was there at 6 that morning because my sister Mabel had an infusion at 8, and infusions meant a copay of $214 I did not have unless I picked up the overtime shift first. Denise Pruitt, who ran records like a woman guarding a vault of nothing, told me at 6:04 that my blouse was wrinkled and that wrinkled women did not get promoted out of basements. She said it the way she said everything, pleasant on top and rotten underneath, and I said thank you, because thank you cost nothing and arguing cost my job. At 6:40, I went to the cafe cart outside the north entrance because it was the only place open and because the woman who ran it, Dolores, always gave me the day-old muffin for free. There were 2 orders waiting on the counter in identical white cups with identical cardboard sleeves, and someone had written the names in the same rushed black marker. One said Wren, one said C. Ashworth. I picked up the one nearest my hand without checking, because I had 11 minutes before my shift and a mind already 3 floors down in a filing cabinet. I didn't notice until I was back at my desk, blowing across the lid, that the sleeve against my palm did not say Wren at all. C. Ashworth. Cordelia Ashworth. The judge they called the Marble Bench, because marble does not bend, and in 11 years on that bench, neither had she. I had seen her twice from a distance, both times through the little glass window of a courtroom door I wasn't allowed past. Tall, unmoving, a voice that dropped a room 10 degrees without ever rising in volume. Bailiffs straightened their spines when her elevator dinged. I had heard a public defender say, in the break room, that Judge Ashworth had once sentenced a man to the maximum without looking up from her notes, and that the silence after was worse than shouting would have been. I looked down at the coffee going cold in my hand and thought, with the specific dread of someone who has spent her whole life trying not to be noticed, someone is drinking my burnt gas station drip right now, and it has my name on it. I told myself I would return the cup at lunch, quietly, apologetically, and that would be the end of it. I did not yet understand that Cordelia Ashworth was not a woman who let anything end quietly, including, apparently, the small matter of a stolen coffee. At 10:17, the records room door opened without a knock, and the temperature in the basement seemed to drop the exact way people said it did. She filled the doorway without trying to, dark coat, dark hair, pulled back hard enough to look like a decision rather than a style, and a scent that reached me before she said a word. Bergamot cut through with something colder underneath, like gunmetal warmed by a hand, and then forgotten. I would spend the next several months learning that smell in every one of its moods. In that moment, I only knew it made the hair on my arms stand up. Someone in this building, she said, is currently in possession of my coffee. Denise, to her eternal credit or eternal cowardice, said nothing and became extremely interested in a filing cabinet. I stood. My chair scraped. It sounded like a scream in that basement quiet. That would be me, Your Honor. I'm so sorry. I grabbed the wrong, you drank it. I drank about a third of it before I noticed the name. Something moved behind her eyes that was not quite amusement, and not quite anything else I had a word for yet. That cup, she said, was the only thing standing between me and a hearing I have been dreading since Friday. I have precise habits, Miss Calloway. She read my name off the little plastic tag clipped to my blazer, and something about hearing my own name in that low, exact voice made my knees feel unreliable. I do not enjoy surprises before 9 a.m. I can get you another one. There's a cart outside. She does a good. I know where the cart is. A pause, the kind of pause a woman takes when she is deciding whether to let a moment end or push it somewhere else. Next time, check the name before you drink a stranger's coffee. Next time I'll write mine bigger, I said, before I could stop myself. For 1 second, 1 full second, I counted it later, lying awake. The corner of her mouth almost moved. Then, it didn't. She turned, coat sweeping the doorway, and was gone, leaving behind cold air and the ghost of bergamot and gunmetal, and I stood there in a basement full of dead paper, thinking that I had just made the marble bench almost smile, and that it had cost me nothing at all, and that I wanted, with an intensity that frightened me, to do it again. I did not get the chance to plan how. 9 days later, the building did the choosing for me. It happened during the opening of the Holloway asset forfeiture hearing, a case big enough that 2 local news vans had parked outside since dawn. 15 minutes before the gavel, someone discovered that 3 evidence boxes, financial ledgers central to the prosecution's whole argument, had been recatalogued under the wrong docket number sometime in the last year, and no one currently employed in records could find them. Denise went white. The assistant a smooth, sharp-suited man named Marcus Doyle, stood in the doorway of the records room checking his watch every 4 seconds like it might change the answer. I had reorganized that entire wing of shelving myself 8 months earlier, on my own time, because the numbering system had been bothering me the way an off-key note bothers people with perfect pitch. I didn't consciously remember 3 specific boxes. I remembered a mistake, a small transposed digit I'd flagged in my head back then and never mentioned because nobody asks the basement clerk anything. Docket 4471, not 4417, I said, to no one and everyone. Someone swapped the last 2 digits when they logged it. It'll be under the older case, 3rd aisle, 2nd bay from the end, bottom shelf. Because that's where the misfilings from that clerk always land. She never crouches all the way down. Doyle looked at me like I'd spoken in tongues. Denise looked at me like I'd committed treason by being right. I was right. I carried the boxes up myself, through the marble hallway, past a wall of framed portraits of judges who all had the same forbidding eyes, and set them on the clerk's table 4 minutes before the gavel. Judge Ashworth was already on the bench, unmoving, reviewing notes she must have believed were about to become useless. When the boxes appeared, she looked up once, found me in the doorway, and held my gaze for exactly as long as it takes to memorize a face. She said nothing about it, in open court. Judges rarely do. But at 4 that afternoon, a folded note appeared on my desk in handwriting so precise it looked typed. Report to Chambers, Monday, 8 a.m. Bring nothing but yourself. C.A. Denise read it over my shoulder before I could stop her. You're being fired, she said, with the confidence of a woman who wanted it to be true. I did not sleep well that weekend. I told myself it was dread. It was not entirely dread. Monday, 8 a.m., the chambers on the 4th floor smelled like her, bergamot, gunmetal, and beneath it, older, something like rain that had fallen on stone a long time ago and never quite dried. An older woman named Ilsa Brandt, who ran the chambers with the brisk tenderness of someone who had buried a husband and refused to let it make her bitter, told me to sit, that the judge did not like to repeat herself, and that I should sit up straight. Because the judge noticed posture the way other people noticed weather. Judge Ashworth came in at 8 exactly, set down a coffee cup with my name on it, my actual name, this time, in her own square handwriting, and said, "You start today as my research clerk." Records lost a good filer. I intend to find out if they also lost a good lawyer. "I never finished law school," I said, too fast. "I read your file, Miss Calloway. I know precisely why you left." Her eyes didn't soften, but something in her voice did, half a degree, the kind of warmth you'd miss if you weren't listening for it. "I don't chase what I don't intend to keep. Sit down. We have work to do." I sat down. I did not yet know that sentence would come back to me at the worst moment of my life, or that I would spend the following months learning every possible shape of the woman who'd said it. The wealth gap announced itself before she ever did. My studio apartment had one working radiator and a window that looked at a brick wall 11 feet away. Her chambers had floor-to-ceiling glass and a private elevator that required a key. The first week, a court officer named Frank Munro, built like a filing cabinet himself, 22 years on the job, loyal to the judge the way old dogs are loyal, without asking why, looked me up and down in the hallway and said, "Basement girl's her new clerk." That'll last a month. It lasted longer than a month. It lasted because of small things nobody else noticed. She started leaving a second sandwich in the chamber's refrigerator on days she knew I'd worked through lunch, never announcing it, never mentioning it, letting me find it the way you'd let a stray cat find food without spooking it. She corrected exactly one habit of mine, my tendency to apologize before I'd finished a sentence, by simply waiting, silent, until I finished the sentence without the apology attached. She never once commented on my clothes, my blazers, the same 3 rotating outfits, though I caught her once looking at the hem of my coat, worn thin at the cuff, with an expression I couldn't read and didn't ask about. On my 12th day, I found a photograph face down on the shelf behind her desk while dusting. Ilsa's job, technically, but I'd taken it on without being asked. A young woman with a sharp, laughing face, a court ID lanyard still around her neck in the photo, like she'd just come from work. I set it back exactly as I'd found it, face down, and said nothing, but the judge came in 10 minutes later, saw it hadn't moved, and something in her shoulders eased a fraction, like she'd been braced for a question I hadn't asked. Her name was Theodora, she said, unprompted, 3 weeks later, apropos of nothing, while we reviewed a motion at 9 at night, with the city lit up gold below the window. Theo, she was a prosecutor. She's been gone 6 years. She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. But something crossed her face that I recognized, because I wore a version of it myself every time someone asked about Mabel's illness, grief that had learned to hold perfectly still so it wouldn't show. The first charged touch happened over nothing, the way it always does. I reached for a case file at the same moment she did. Her hand closed over mine on the folder's edge and stayed there a half-second longer than filing required. Her scent bloomed warmer in that half-second bergamot gone soft at the edges, and mine, I would learn later, had done something similar. Some sweetness under the vanilla and paper she said I always smelled like, warm paper left too long in sun. Neither of us mentioned it. We both noticed. I went home that night and lay awake, doing the kind of arithmetic you do when you're trying to talk yourself out of hope. It was Marcus Doyle who ended the honeymoon of not talking about it. He came to Chambers on a Thursday afternoon, smiling the smile of a man who has never once been told no, and taken it seriously. "Judge," he said. "I need the sealed exhibit list for Holloway. Off the record, of course." "Nothing about a sealed list is off the record, Marcus." Her voice had gone flat and final, a door closing. "Just professional courtesy. Ask my clerk for the public docket. That's all you're entitled to." She didn't look up from her papers again, and he left with his smile gone thinner at the edges, and I remember thinking, with a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, that a man like that did not simply accept no. He filed it away. I had spent my whole life being underestimated by men like that. I recognized the look he gave me on his way out, the look of someone deciding I was a problem worth solving later, quietly, when no one was watching. I did not know yet how right I was, or how soon later would come. Later came 11 days after that, on a Tuesday, which I noted with a bitterness I didn't examine too closely, since it had also been a Tuesday when I'd stolen a stranger's coffee and started all of this. A reporter from the city paper published a story quoting, verbatim, 3 lines from the sealed Holloway exhibit list, the very document Doyle had asked for and been refused. By 10 a.m., the courthouse hallway outside Chambers was a hive of hushed, delighted scandal. By 11, Doyle himself stood in the doorway of Chambers with 2 courthouse security officers and an expression of manufactured regret so thin I could see through it like cheap glass. "Miss Calloway had access to that document," he said. "Sole access. Outside the judge herself." "I never printed it. I never sent it anywhere," I said, and heard my own voice climb. The way it used to in Denise's basement when panic outran good sense. "The access log says otherwise." He held up a printed sheet like a trophy. "Timestamp, 11:47 p.m., 3 nights ago. Your credentials." I had been asleep at 11:47 3 nights ago, in my apartment with the one working radiator, but proving where you were at midnight when you live alone is not proof. It's just a story, and stories are cheap next to timestamps. Judge Ashworth stood. I had never seen her stand that fast. "This clerk has worked in my chambers for 6 weeks with an unimpeachable record," she said, and her voice had dropped into the register I'd heard her use on defendants who thought they could talk their way out of consequences. "If you believe a crime occurred, Marcus, file it properly. Don't stage a hallway theater. I have to refer it to the ethics board regardless, Your Honor. You understand." He did not look like a man who regretted anything. I was suspended by lunch, pending investigation, escorted out past Denise, who watched with an expression she didn't bother to disguise as sympathy. In the elevator down, alone, I let myself cry exactly until the doors opened on the ground floor, and then I stopped, because crying in a courthouse lobby is its own kind of headline. Judge Ashworth found me on the courthouse steps 40 minutes later, coatless, which for a woman who never went anywhere without her coat felt like an alarm bell in itself. "I know you didn't do this," she said. "The log says I did." Logs can be altered by anyone with root access and half a motive. Her jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle in it. "I intend to find out who had both." That should have comforted me. Instead, I went home to my studio apartment and found the door already unlocked, though I distinctly remembered locking it, and a single sheet of paper on my kitchen table that had not been there that morning. "Stop looking at things that aren't yours." I called the judge before I called the police, and I have never fully forgiven myself or fully regretted it for that order of operations. She arrived in 11 minutes, which meant she'd been driving before I finished the sentence "Someone's been in my apartment." She stood in my doorway, taking in the cracked linoleum, the single lamp, the mattress on a frame I'd bought secondhand, and I watched her face do something complicated that wasn't pity. Because pity would have been unbearable, and wasn't quite anything I had a name for either. "You're not staying here tonight," she said. "I can't just," That wasn't a request, Miss Calloway, Wren, my name, unadorned by title, for the first time. It landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there. Her brownstone had 4 floors, a security system that required 2 separate codes, and a guest room with sheets so soft I stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before I could make myself walk in. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, unable to sleep, I found her in the kitchen, not sleeping either, holding a chipped blue mug she wasn't drinking from. "That's not one of your matching ones," I said, nodding at the mug, because my mouth apparently ran on nerves when the rest of me had none left. It was hers. She didn't have to say whose. I keep it because throwing it away felt like a second funeral. She set it down. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, rain hammering the windows like it had somewhere urgent to be. Tell me to stop asking, and I will. But I'd like to know why a woman with a law degree half-finished chose to spend 3 years filing paper in a basement instead. I didn't finish because Mabel got sick. My sister. Leukemia when she was 15. I was in my 2nd year. The scholarship didn't cover a hospital, and someone had to work, and I was the one who could drop out without anyone noticing I was gone. I said it flatly, the way you learn to say things that used to make you cry until they stopped. She's better now. Mostly, it cost what it cost. Something in her face cracked open, just slightly, just for me. "Tell me to stop," she said again, quieter, and crossed the kitchen, and stopped close enough that bergamot and gunmetal filled the space between us, close enough that I could feel warmth coming off her like a held breath. "Don't stop," I said. She kissed me like she did everything, deliberate, controlled, restraint stretched taut over something enormous underneath, and when she finally pulled back, she pressed her forehead to mine and said, "Lo, I don't chase what I don't intend to keep," and I understood, finally, that she'd been telling me that sentence since the day I stole her coffee, and I had simply been too afraid to believe it was about me. The weeks that followed were the strangest, softest weeks of my life. I stayed in the guest room that quietly became less of a guest room. She was, I discovered, catastrophically bad at operating a coffee maker, despite drinking coffee like other people drink water, and the sight of the marble bench cursing quietly at a jammed filter basket at 6 in the morning did more to heal something in me than any of the money or the marble ever could. Ilsa took to leaving 2 mugs out instead of 1 without comment. Frank Monroe, watching the judge wait, in the hallway, for someone to catch up to her stride, was overheard telling another officer, "In 15 years, I've never once seen her wait for anybody," and I let myself believe for a while that the worst of it was over. She remembered things. I mentioned once, in passing, that I used to love the cardamom buns from a bakery 3 blocks from my old law school, back before Mabel got sick, back when I still believed my life was going to look a certain way. 2 weeks later, there was a box of them on the kitchen counter, still warm, with no explanation offered, because none was needed. I mentioned that Mabel had always wanted to see the ocean and had never been. A week after that, a manila envelope appeared with train tickets to the coast, made out in Mabel's name, for a weekend 6 months out, a promise stretched across time, the kind only someone paying real attention could make. The ethics investigation cleared me in 9 days, once a forensic auditor confirmed the login timestamp had been spoofed from an external terminal 1 floor down from Doyle's own office. He was reprimanded, quietly, informally, the way powerful men often are, and I made the mistake, the fatal, hopeful mistake, of thinking that meant it was finished. It was Priya, my one real friend left over from records, who called me on a Thursday evening with her voice pitched wrong. Too fast. Too careful. "Wren, I need you to not panic," she said, which is the surest way to guarantee panic. There's a warrant. Doyle's saying you tampered with the Holloway ledgers before they went missing the first time. Says he's got a witness. Ren, they're coming to the house. I remember the exact sound the front door made 40 minutes later. 3 hard knocks and then no knock at all, just entry. 2 officers I didn't recognize, with a warrant signed by a judge who was not Cordelia Ashworth, because of course it wasn't. Because Doyle had known exactly which judge to route it past. I remember Cordelia standing in the hallway, with a stillness so absolute it frightened me more than the officers did, because I understood, watching her, that this was the exact posture of a woman choosing, with tremendous effort, not to become someone she'd spent her whole career condemning. "I will have you out within the hour," she said, and her voice was ice again, the courtroom ice, the ice that had made her name, and I understood that she had put it back on deliberately, like armor, because falling apart in front of these men would not help me. "I know," I said. "I trust you. They took me anyway." I left my phone on the hallway table, mid-charge, her last text still glowing on the screen unanswered, "Home by 7, save me some of the buns." And the last thing I saw before the door closed was her face, composed, controlled, and one hand pressed flat against her own chest like she was holding something in by force. The holding cell smelled like bleach and old fear, and I sat on a bench built for people the system had already decided about, and for the first time since the coffee cup. I let myself believe I might lose everything I'd only just been handed. They didn't put me in a normal cell. That should have told me something sooner than it did. 2 men who were not police, wearing borrowed authority the way some men wear cologne, moved me at 11 that night to a windowless room in a building I didn't recognize, told me it was a secure holding annex, and left me with a folding chair, a bare bulb, and a stack of ledgers someone had apparently decided I should be surrounded with, as if proximity to evidence could manufacture guilt through osmosis. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that, because the fear was real, and it did not go away for 1 full hour of sitting in that chair, listening to men talk in low voices through a door that didn't fully close. But somewhere in the second hour, my hands, which had nothing else to do, started sorting the ledgers on the table without my permission, the way they always had. The way they'd sorted 3 misfiled boxes back when nobody was watching. And the numbers told me something the men outside hadn't meant for me to see. The ledgers weren't Holloway's. They were newer, dated within the last 4 months, and they tracked payments, regular, patterned, always routed through a shell account labeled only MD Consulting, from 3 companies I recognized from Doyle's own asset forfeiture cases, the very cases he was supposedly prosecuting on behalf of the city. He wasn't covering for the syndicate. He was the syndicate's accountant. I found 7 separate transfers, memorized the account numbers the way I used to memorize case docket errors, tore a strip of cardboard from the ledger's cover, and wrote the numbers on it in pen, small enough to hide in the hem of my sleeve, because some habits, noticing, remembering, refusing to let the pattern lie to me, no locked room could take away. They came for me again near 2 in the morning. I heard Frank Munro's voice before I saw his face, louder than I'd ever heard it, and then the door came open the rest of the way, and Cordelia was in the doorway, coat gone, sleeves pushed up, an expression on her face I had never seen and hope never to see again, not the ice, not the control. Something underneath both of those things, unleashed, one of the men reached for something at his belt. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember standing between them, my back to his hand, my eyes on hers, and saying the only thing that mattered in that room. Don't. Cordelia, don't become what he is. She stopped. It cost her visibly, A full body effort, like holding a door shut against a wind that wanted it open. In the 2 seconds that stretching stillness bought, Frank got the man's wrist behind his back, and somewhere behind them uniformed officers, real ones this time, ones Cordelia had apparently called herself, quietly on the drive over, using every favor 11 years on the bench had bought her, flooded into the room. She crossed to me in 3 strides, and one of the men, retreating, caught her across the forearm with something sharp enough to open a line of blood through her sleeve, a wound meant for me that landed on her instead, and she didn't so much as flinch, just pulled me against her chest with her uninjured arm like she could fold the last 3 hours out of existence by pressing hard enough. "I have him," I said into her collar, bergamot and blood, and something underneath both that I understood, dimly, was fear finally allowed to surface. "Doyle, I have the accounts. I have proof. Then we're going to use it," she said, and her voice had gone thin, worn down to the wire beneath the ice. And then, "Wren Calloway, I am never letting you out of arm's reach again." The hearing that followed happened in her own courtroom 9 days later, though by then it was barely a hearing at all, more a public execution of a reputation, conducted with the terrible calm procedure allows. The forensic accountant Cordelia brought in confirmed every number on my strip of cardboard within an hour. The city's own auditors, once shown where to look, found 11 more accounts behind it. Marcus Doyle stood at the prosecution table where he had stood 100 times sending other people to prison, and for once in his life had nothing smooth left to say. The gallery was full. Denise Pruitt sat 3 rows back, arms crossed, mouth a thin line, watching the woman she'd once told to fix her wrinkled blouse get named. On the record, as the person whose recall of a filing error had originally exposed the pattern nobody else had caught in 4 years. I did not enjoy the moment as much as I'd once imagined I would. I enjoyed it anyway, a little, and I think that's allowed. Cordelia did not preside over Doyle's case. Recusal was required, given everything. And she stepped down from the bench for that single docket with a formality that cost her nothing to grant and everything to sit through as a spectator instead of the one holding the gavel. But she stood in front of the assembled press afterward, on the courthouse steps where she'd once found me coatless and shaking, and said, in the flat, exact voice the city had learned to fear, the integrity of this court was protected by a clerk this system nearly discarded twice. I intend to see that it doesn't happen a 3rd time. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Every camera in that crowd turned to find me anyway. That night, in the brownstone, with the storm long past and the windows open to a city finally quiet, she knelt in front of the fireplace, not for a ring that would come later, its own separate, softer scene, but with her wrist bared, the mark of the blade from the annex still healing pink along her forearm. "I want to give you a bond," she said, "not because you're mine to claim. Because I choose you every day, and I want my body to say so as plainly as I've been trying to say it with words." She reached for my hand, pressed my fingers over the scent gland at the base of her throat, warm, alive, bergamot and gunmetal gone entirely soft. "Tell me to stop, and I will." "Don't stop," I said for the 2nd time in my life, and meant it more than I had ever meant anything. The bite, when it came, was gentle in a way I hadn't known a claiming could be, more promise than possession, and the bond that opened between us afterward felt less like being caught, and more like a door finally being left unlocked from both sides. I felt her relief through it before she said a word, relief so old and so carefully hidden that it had calcified into ice years before I ever spilled her coffee, and now, at last, was allowed to melt. The proposal came 4 months later, in spring, on the courthouse steps where the whole strange story had started, though this time with cameras absent and only Frank and Priya and Ilsa and Mabel, pink-cheeked and healthy and unbearably delighted, standing witness. Cordelia knelt on the marble, a small worn box in her palm, and said, "I don't chase what I don't intend to keep. I've known that about you since the day you drank a third of my coffee and apologized for it like I might have you arrested. You might have. That first week," I said, laughing through tears I hadn't planned on. "I might have," she agreed. "I'm glad I didn't." We married in September, in Ilsa's garden, small and quiet the way Cordelia liked things that mattered most. Frank walked me down a path of exactly 9 paces and told me, gruffly, before he let go of my arm, that he had worked beside that woman for 15 years and never once seen her wait for anyone, not until me, and that if I ever made her wait again, it had better be worth it. Priya cried through the entire ceremony and blamed allergies. Mabel gave a toast that involved, at length, the ocean trip and the cardamom buns, and one line that made Cordelia laugh out loud in public for the first time anyone present had ever witnessed. My sister stole this woman's coffee and somehow ended up stealing her whole heart. I'd call that a fair trade. A year on, Marcus Doyle was 3 months into a federal sentence that would keep him behind walls for a decade, his shell accounts seized and redirected, by court order, into a fund for wrongly displaced court employees. Denise Pruitt was not among its beneficiaries, having been quietly demoted out of records entirely after the ethics board finished reviewing exactly how many complaints against her had gone conveniently unfiled over the years. I did not gloat. I let myself, once, smile about it over coffee, which felt like enough. I did finish my law degree, in the end, 2 nights a week for 2 years, with Cordelia quizzing me on procedure across the kitchen table while burning the toast with impressive, consistent regularity. I sat for the bar the following spring. I have not yet argued a case, but I have already been told, by more than one clerk in that basement I used to call home, that they've heard the wrinkled blouse girl from records is coming up to argue in front of judges now, and that some of them are afraid of what she'll notice. On the morning I'm remembering now, the one I keep coming back to, 2 mugs sat side by side on our kitchen windowsill in the first gray light before the coffee maker had finished its slow, complaining work. Mine plain white, hers chipped and blue, both of them, finally, exactly where they belonged. A name on a cup is only ink until someone comes looking for the person who carries it home. I had spent 26 years being overlooked by rooms that never bothered to check whose name was printed on me at all. It took one cold, exact woman refusing to let a small mistake go unclaimed to teach me that being seen, completely and on purpose, is not luck. It is a choice, made and remade every morning, the way she chose me, deliberately, precisely, without ever once looking away. The end.